Hi everyone, I'm Wendy Muse, creator of the Left Pocket Project, which brings you the history of leftists of color one swipe at a time. And this is the Left Pocket Project podcast. Before we get started with today's episode, I wanted to remind everyone that they can subscribe to the podcast on Soundcloud, Spreaker, and iTunes, where I encourage you to leave me a comment as well as a rating. You can also check out what's going on with the project, which, by the way, is more than a podcast, by checking out @LeftPOC, and that's LEFTPOC on social media. Finally, you can show your support and get additional updates about the project by donating $1 or more on patreon.com/leftpoc. In today's episode, I speak with Professor Anne-Marie Angelo about the Israeli Black Panthers, a group of Arab and North African Jews who expressed political dissent and made their grievances regarding poor living conditions, police brutality, and a lack of political representation, among many other issues very well known, following their founding in 1971. Anne-Marie is a cultural historian and professor at the University of Sussex. She holds a PhD in history from Duke University, where she studied the interactions between the U.S. Civil Rights Movement and racial formations outside of the United States. In her forthcoming book, Global Freedom Struggle, The Black Panthers of Israel, the United Kingdom, and the United States, Professor Angelo examines the Black Panther movements of Israel and the United Kingdom in order to understand how Black power was transformed from an African American movement to a global Black freedom struggle. The study draws upon a wide range of sources, including oral histories that she conducted, oral histories conducted by others, photographs, personal manuscripts, and police files, in order to center the role that people of color outside the United States played in confronting American and British imperialisms from the grassroots. Professor Angelo has held fellowships for Arabic and Middle Eastern studies and has also received several awards for mentoring, teaching, and student support. Here is our conversation. Hi everyone, today I am joined by Professor Anne-Marie Angelo. Anne-Marie, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks, Wendy, for having me.
So I was really interested in your project for several reasons, one of which actually started a long time ago when I was speaking to a colleague of mine who herself identified as an Arab Israeli or an Israeli Jew of Arab descent. And she mentioned to me while living in New York that she felt incredibly white, and she felt the whitest she'd ever felt in her entire life. And so for me as a Black person, I'm looking at my friend and I'm like, but you are white. I didn't fully understand what she meant by feeling white for the first time in her life. So I didn't quite put two and two together. But the more and more we spoke about her past and her family's background, and she explained to me that there were all these sort of movements based around ethnic identity within Israel, being Arab Jews, and being, as they call themselves, Mizrahi, how there was a sense of difference, and how that there were even social movements in relation to this sense of difference and their place in Israeli society. So that was my first introduction to this idea of the Israeli Black Panthers. And so when I heard your talk at Aswad in Spain a few months ago, I was super interested in where you were taking this and learning more about the history of the Israeli Black Panthers, how they came about, who they exactly were, and what their numbers and demands were. So if you could start us off just by giving a little bit of background about who the Israeli Black Panthers were, and again, where they're from, how they got their start, and what they were all about.
Great. Thanks so much. It's always interesting to hear the experiences of Mizrahi Jews in different places in the diaspora, because I think there is a vastly different sense of racial identity that Mizrahi Jews have within Israel, perhaps compared to in other parts of the world. So the Israeli Black Panthers were a social movement that formed in early 1971. They were started by a group of late teenaged young men, almost all men, in Jerusalem. They were essentially a group of friends who lived in a neighborhood called Muzrara, also known as Morasha. And Muzrara was a neighborhood on the periphery. It was originally on the boundary between East and West Jerusalem. And then after the Six-Day War of 1967, Israel gained territory and gained control of the old city of Jerusalem. And so it was technically no longer on the border at that point, but the people who lived in that neighborhood certainly felt still on the periphery of society. So Mizrahi was populated by people from across the Middle East and North Africa, from Morocco, Yemen, Iraq, Lebanon, and they found that they had all been placed to live in the same neighborhood that was on the outskirts of the city, whereas most European Jews or Ashkenazi Jews were living in the city center. And their conditions of housing were pretty bad. Some of them lived in houses lived in apartment blocks or houses that were massively overcrowded. The founder of the organization, a Moroccan Jew named Saadia Marciano, actually wrote a letter to the city government talking about the sewage that was running down his street. And he wrote this in the aftermath of the 1967 war in hopes that now that he and his friends no longer lived on the periphery, that they would get better treatment from the government. And that turned out to not be the case. So this group of friends began gathering at a community youth center and learning about various struggles going on in different parts of the world. And they heard about the struggle of the Black Panthers and the fact that the Panthers in the United States were standing up against a lot of the discrimination that African Americans were facing. And they found this really inspiring. They also knew that Golda Meir had lived in the United States and that the Black Panthers in the United States, at least within Israeli perceptions, but also among some other Jews' perceptions, had a reputation for anti-Semitism. Mm-hmm. And they specifically took on the Black Panther name as a way of, as they said, bringing a shock to the Israeli system. So they took on a name that they knew would be shocking, rather than taking on what would have been the name of a more reformist African-American organization such as the NAACP. So they made a series of demands in their first protest, which were essentially anti-poverty demands around housing, education, and employment, and then a demand against police harassment, because many of the founding members of the organization had spent time in jail, had been harassed, and in some cases beaten by the police, and they decided that they were fed up. And so they created their first kind of mass protest on the 3rd of March, 1971. And to advertise, they passed out flyers that declared that they had had enough with living in overcrowded conditions, enough with not having adequate schooling and being forced to learn Hebrew when for most of them their first language was Arabic, enough with not being able to find jobs once they had left school, and enough with being mistreated by the police. And their first protest proved challenging to pull off because of requirements getting a permit to hold the event. And the city wanted to try to stop it from happening. But in the end, they were able to hold the event and gained a lot of support, both from other would-be Mizrahi Jews and as well as from Ashkenazi university students, members of the Jewish left, from among the Ashkenazi population. So a fairly diverse group of people turned out in support.
I just wanted to back up a little bit because
Sure.
we're using a lot of terms that I'm thinking, does everyone know exactly what that means? And
Yes.
even some of who these players are, right? So I wanted to talk just briefly about the ethnic question that these Mizrahi Jews are sort of organizing around. First of all, if you could talk a little bit more about what it means at this time, and you're talking, late 60s, early 70s, what does it mean at this time to identify as someone who is Mizrahi or even a Sephardic Jew, what those terms mean? And then also, how do Arab Jews sort of fit into the larger justification of the Israeli state, particularly one being built around suffering after the Holocaust or after expulsions from the USSR? Where do Arab Jews fit into this, particularly as their narrative of struggle is quite different from those of Ashkenazi Jews?
Great questions. Thanks. So Mizrahi is the Hebrew word for Eastern. And at the time that we're talking about, these Jews were actually identified within Ashkenazi Israeli society as Oriental. And that was the common language that was used. And actually, one of the most important things that the Israeli Black Panthers accomplished was that they began really using the language of Mizrahi Judaism. So up until this point, if you were someone who fell under Mizrahi or Eastern Jewish identity, you wouldn't have necessarily identified that way. You would have called yourself Moroccan or Iraqi or Yemeni because their dialects of Arabic were different. Their own experiences of life in their previous countries had been very different based on the different places from which they had come. So the kind of creation of a Mizrahi ethnic identity as a pan identity to signify people who had come from the countries of the Middle East and North Africa really came about through the Black Panther organization. And as far as where they fit into kind of the founding of Israel and the post-Holocaust experience of Jews, one of the most, I guess, interesting parts about their development is that they were able to come to Israel. Some came through economic migration, but others came through not necessarily through choice. There are some reports of anti-Semitism in those countries, which they left. There are also reports in other places of the Zionist Israeli government going to those countries and recruiting people quite heavily, in both outwardly, propagandistic ways, and then sometimes in covert ways. So the kind of simple fact of their existence in Israel was not necessarily presupposed by the founding of the Israeli state. Some did go because they wanted to, or they feared anti-Semitism in their countries, and others were heavily recruited and encouraged to go.
Mm-hmm. And one of the readings that you had sent me, actually, the author refers to, or at least I believe one of the people that he had interviewed refers to it as a sort of domestic diaspora, right? So a diaspora within a diaspora, which sort of leads me back to this discussion of Blackness. So why, if you could explain why they decided to pick up that term, not just because of the idea of the Black Panthers in the U.S., but it seems that there is some sort of racialization even within the Israeli context that they closely identified with this idea of Blackness. Can you talk a bit about that and where that came from?
Sure. So, one kind of simple fact to keep in mind is that they identified as Black, given that by skin tone, their skin tone was darker than that of most European Jews, even though in an African diasporic sense, we wouldn't necessarily associate that. But on a much broader level, they kind of called down Blackness as part of their identity because they arrived in Israel and they believed or kind of supposed that they were arriving in this socialist Zionist state. And upon their arrival, they found that they were often placed living in development towns, which were kind of working class towns on the periphery of the country, or in the case of people living in Mizrahi, that they were placed on the outskirts of cities, that their provisions in terms of education, healthcare, housing were far worse than those that European Jews were receiving. And again, they thought that they were arriving into a socialist country. So this struck them as really surprising. And then on top of that, there were discussions from leading figures within the country about fears that Arab Jews who were arriving were going to, quote unquote, Levantize the country and turn it more Eastern than its leaders wanted it to be. And there were various kind of racial slurs that were hurled, like particularly against Moroccan Jews, but also against any Jews who didn't hail from European countries. So they really faced a sense of being racialized as an other. And there wasn't necessarily a language for that because, again, the kind of ideology behind the founding of the State of Israel was around a concept of a melting pot, of a place where all Jews could come and have a home. And they suddenly found that their home looked quite different to some of their European neighbors. And so this created a kind of sense of consciousness among particularly second-generation immigrants to the country who started to talk about this and to meet other Mizrahi or people of color from other neighborhoods who were experiencing the same thing. And through these discussions, there became an awareness that they had been given the equivalent of what we would, in the U.S., we would have called second-class citizenship. And this awareness led them to want to challenge what the government was presenting as a socialist Zionist ideal.
So one thing, too, that your comments here make me consider is, so the neighborhood that you had mentioned earlier was literally called the Seam, if I'm not mistaken, right? It was the nickname of it, because it was on sort of the fault lines between the sort of Arab states and as well as Palestinian spaces and the newly formed Israeli state, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
That's right, yes.
So this sort of spatial and geographic layout also is highly symbolic in and of itself. And I was wondering, where do Palestinians fit into this? Particularly because I'm assuming that some of these Arab Jews or Mizrahi Jews are also potentially from Palestine, right? They're people who may have grown up there under Palestinian governance. So where do they fit and how do they differentiate themselves, if at all? Are they even trying to do that? How do they differentiate themselves as Israelis versus Palestinian Arabs and the like? What are the fault lines politically there?
Yeah, so one important thing I think for us to keep in mind is that that spatial geographic difference or separation was massively important, not only politically, but also as a fact of life and as something that kind of precluded certain types of organizing. So Arab Jews living in Israel were technically not allowed to enter Palestine at this point in time. And so to be interested in the Palestinian cause was possible, but the opportunities for coalition were severely curtailed by the security of the Some state. But with that said, it became in some ways a major dividing issue within the organization. So some members of the organization, a number of whom were Iraqi, wanted to meet with the PLO. And in fact, one member, Kokavi Shemesh, traveled into Palestine in 1972 and met with members of the PLO. And so there was interest and there was effort, and yet to form alliances. And yet organizationally, some other members of the organization, the Black Panthers, felt that it was in the group's best interest to maintain focus on their grassroots organizing within their own neighborhoods for various reasons. Some of those being that they hadn't yet achieved their aims within those neighborhoods, but then also some of the individuals who didn't want to really venture across the border, I believe, faced greater vulnerability within the Israeli state. A lot of them were Moroccan, and Moroccan Jews were the subject of the greatest amount of racism among all of the Mizrahi population, and I would argue were most likely to be criminalized and prosecuted if they were to have been caught crossing the border. So there were kind of multiple crisscrossing lines of possibility, but also of vulnerability that I think led to there not being perhaps as much of a coalition with Palestinians as we might as we might have wanted there to be, or as we might kind of assume that there might naturally could have been.
Mm-hmm. Why, just going back a bit, why was there more discrimination towards or against Moroccan Jews? If you could talk a little bit more about that. What was the situation?
Sure. Moroccan Jews had essentially, among the Mizrahi immigrant groups that came into the country, Moroccans were a considerable sized group, but they were also a group that had come from, and I say this in very relative terms, but had come from greater relative poverty than some of the other Middle Eastern groups who entered the country. So comparatively speaking, I think 36% of Iraqis who were immigrants into the country had been in white-collar jobs in Iraq before migrating into Israel, versus Moroccans had largely come from, there were some middle-class Moroccans, but a greater percentage of those had come from tougher economic circumstances. And so they were racialized due to their lower economic standing, but also perceptions of Moroccans as, I hesitate to want to kind of resurrect some of the ethnic slurs, but as more backward, as more unclean, as more potentially damaging to the kind of image and reputation of a proud socialist country than were some of the other migrants.
And I'm wondering too if there's, again, a sort of geographic and if not ethnic reason for that as well. I mean, these Moroccans are African technically, right?
Yes.
Versus, Middle Eastern or even European. So I'm wondering if their Africanness also sort of contributes to their treatment, perhaps even within and among other Mizrahi Jews.
I think that's right. I think that's absolutely right. The other kind of key African group, or one of the largest, was Egyptian Jews. And Egyptian Jews had come from a slightly different kind of Judaism within Egypt had a slightly different socioeconomic standing than it did for many Moroccans. And certainly the darker skin tone of many Moroccans led to them being racialized as closer to Black, if we might say it that way, than other Middle Eastern and North African Jews. So they really found themselves in a much more vulnerable position than really any other group, I would argue.
I wanted to ask you more, too, about this, speaking of proximity to Blackness, right? You had mentioned to me that this aspect of your project is actually a very small part of it, right? This idea of the Israeli Black Panthers. You actually speak more about other forms of political Blackness and other iterations, including the original iteration of the Black Panthers in the United States and elsewhere. If you could talk a bit about your entire project and where this particular aspect of your project fits into the whole.
Sure. So I'm currently writing a book called Global Freedom Struggle, which is about the Black Panthers of the UK, the US, and Israel. And one of the things I'm really trying to think through in the book is why many different groups outside the United States, in fact, groups of people of color in 6 different countries, became Black Panthers, sort of at the same time or slightly after the founding of the U.S. Black Panther Party. So a significant portion of my book explores the British Black Panther movement, who were comprised of people from the Caribbean, from South Asia, and from West Africa. And they found that the Black Panther kind of political ideology and style gave them the opportunity to create, or to attempt to create, a kind of pan-ethnic identity among people of color within Britain. So crucially, they were interested, although the majority of the group was from the Caribbean, they were also interested in the involvement, for example, of South Asians in London. And so that group existed. It was the first group to form outside the United States, and they existed from 1967 to 73. So existed a few years prior to the Israeli Black Panthers, but interestingly, also supported them. So when the Israeli Black Panthers held their first protest in March 1971, a group of British Panthers marched on the Israeli embassy in London in support of their comrades in Israel. So I think this was a particular moment, historically speaking, when there was a sense of fluidity around what Blackness meant, and kind of the political power that came with claiming one's own identity as a person of color, and recognizing that, that the specific term Black for people meant not simply a sense of group identification, although that was massively important, but it also meant a sense of political calling and of political identity that people realized they could share, whether their background was North African, Middle Eastern, Caribbean, South Asian. And it defied, in many ways, the sort of classical structures or groupings that were given to people based on the specific places they came from. It was a broader kind of diasporic identity, I think, of people. Of my argument in the book is that it's an identity of displaced people of color, and that can mean people who are from the Middle East. It can mean people who are from the more traditionally received parts of the African diaspora.
Mm-hmm. What's interesting, too, is that not only does Blackness sort of exist as this unifying element, but from what I've read of your work, it also seems to be a space where there is quite a considerable amount of breakdown. And you mentioned at one point, I believe you and another writer as well had mentioned that there were some tensions around the use by the Israeli Black Panthers of the term Black. Could you talk a bit about that and how that played out in the larger global idea of Black Panthers and Blackness itself?
Sure. I think, as I mentioned earlier, the Black Panthers in Israel were aware that there were perceptions of anti-Semitism among Black Panthers in the United States. And they took that identity on very self-consciously in light of that. And so they knew that to call themselves Black and to call themselves Black Panthers would raise curiosity and awareness, particularly, they thought or hoped, among American Jews, who they knew were significant, many of whom were significant donors to the fledgling Israeli state. So that was a big part of it. But there was also a way in which Black and Blackness had been a slur that had been used against Mizrahi Jews. And they chose, again, to kind of call themselves Black in a way of reclaiming that identity, to give new definition to the use of the term Black that had been kind of used to castigate them. So in that sense, it kind of allowed for a kind of reclaiming of identity. But there were other groups, other social groups within Israel who were interested in, the identity of Moroccans or in the identity of North African Jews who hadn't chosen to use this term Black, because to use it suggested that there was a significant ethnic divide, that there was racism within Israel, and not all of the migrant groups, and certainly not the Israeli government, were quite prepared to acknowledge the level of socioeconomic division and structural racism that existed. So it was quite controversial to call themselves Black when that hadn't traditionally been used before.
And it seems like it was also controversial at this point among other Black Panthers, or like in the U.S., for example, right? So if I remember correctly, Angela Davis, I believe, takes issue with the use of the term Black on the Israeli Black Panthers side. And also there's this other disconnect of the U.S. Black Panthers being more or less explicitly in support of Palestine, right, and Palestinian rights. So I'm wondering, how did they kind of navigate those waters? We're going to use this idea that you guys started, but we disagree with certain political aspects. How did they kind of deal with that, just in a rhetorical sense?
It's a great question. I think one of the things that is good to keep in mind here is the relative, at least in the beginning, at least in the founding moments of this organization, the relative lack of knowledge about the Panthers in the United States, right? So anything they knew was either coming to them through newspapers that had been translated into Hebrew, or articles, rather, that had been translated into Hebrew and appeared in Israeli national newspapers, or through interactions with members of the Ashkenazi left, some of whom were American students, for example, who were studying at the Hebrew University. So in the early stages, I would say that what they gathered was what made the headlines. And over time, as, for example, the Panthers in the U.S. Took an explicitly pro-Palestinian stance, I would say that the Israeli Panthers, some of them took this information on and really tried to push the organization in that direction. And then others wanted to really focus on the grassroots concerns of their neighborhoods, and felt that the international questions for them were going to be incredibly fraught. So I think in that sense, it was a messy adaptation. You know, I wouldn't call it necessarily perhaps a parallel organization. In some ways, aspects were adapted. And then in other ways, certain aspects of the American Panthers were let go because, as you note, the sort of levels of blackness or the gradations of blackness or the ways in which ethnicity played out within Israel meant that there was an effort, especially after the Black Panther movement, by some people who had been involved in it, to distance themselves from the concerns of Palestinians. And so in that sense, I don't think that they represented necessarily the same aims as the U.S. movement.
One of the things that I thought was interesting as well is the Israeli Black Panthers' relationship to the press. So, and I would love to hear a bit more about that, but that seems to be a place of parallel, right? Sort of the ways that they use aesthetics and their politics to kind of claim a space within the Israeli press, much like the Black Panthers had used aesthetics and certain political choices and even public displays, to kind of claim their space within the press and sort of define themselves in a more public space and a more public consciousness. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about that and were they received well by the press in Israel, or were they more or less receiving a similar reception as the Black Panthers in the U.S.?
Yeah, they certainly were very conscious, even when they chose the name for their organization, conscious and I would say hopeful that they would get attention for their aims and concerns. And that definitely became the case. So their name was a memorable one because the consciousness around the American Black Panthers was already strong within Israel. And so they noted that they would get little mentions in the press in the early days where other groups wouldn't necessarily get them. And their protest style, similarly to the Panthers in the United States, was very visual, very embodied. And so, for example, during one of their most famous protests, they carried 3 coffins into Zion Square that they members held on their shoulders. And attached to these coffins were different words related to things that they wanted to bury, such as poverty, racism. And this, of course, was interesting for photographers, for journalists, and resulted in greater publicity for the organization. In terms of how they were perceived, There were members of the white left who were sympathetic to their causes, but there were also a lot of people who didn't speak well of them. So Golda Meir's famous quotation after meeting with the Black Panthers in the week of their first protest, she kind of was reporting back to the media and she said, "These are not nice people." And although, today that by our standards, that probably seems fairly mild within political discourse, at the time, it was really an effort to downplay their concerns, to downplay their humanity, and to sort of push them out of the public eye. But over time, support for their movement grew. So they ended up spreading into about 23 different towns across Israel. They had large public protests over this kind of concentrated period from 1971 to 73. So they actually gained a lot of attention. And I think in some ways, Meir's lambasting of them contributed to that.
So this is interesting, too, because Golda Meir is, of course, a woman and a woman with great political power at the time. And I'm wondering, where were the women in the Israeli Black Panthers? Because in the U.S. case, there are quite a few Black women who are involved in leadership or even behind the scenes doing quite a bit of work. And they become oftentimes the face of the Black Panthers in the press, right? There are all these interviews and photographic displays and the like of women with afros and women making speeches and things like that. I'm wondering, were there women involved in the Israeli Black Panthers and what some of those women did in terms of their political involvement?
So the actual membership of the organization was nearly all male. There were a few women who were involved as members. That said, similar to how you've described the women in the Panthers in the U.S., there were many women who behind the scenes did a lot of the administrative work, a lot of the day-to-day care work and support work that the organization needed. So there's a photograph of a meeting in a member, Reuven Abergel's home, in which the group is discussing a manifesto that they have sitting out in front of them. And in the corner of the photograph, Reuven's wife is sleeping because she had been doing all the work to prepare for the meeting.
Of course.
Preparing food for everyone coming over and also caring for her family, and is probably exhausted at that point. So I think that women, in the case of the Israeli Panthers, did not largely become the public face of the organization. And there are various reasons for that. One being that the members tended to come from heavily masculinized societies. And another being that the aspects of criminalization and police harassment that were critical to the founding of the organization had been mainly experienced up until this point by male youth. With that said, over the course of the Panthers' existence, many women got involved in their protests. Many of those women got arrested and experienced the same kinds of violent harassment that men had. So there was female involvement, and yet there was some internal sexism, I would argue, around allowing women or having women as the kind of speaking forefront of the organization.
It's an interesting sort of juxtaposition because, again, you have a woman who is, and I believe Golda Meir is of Ashkenazi descent, right? She identifies as of European descent. And to have this sort of contrast of a quote-unquote white Jewish person and a woman in power versus a quote-unquote black group of Jewish people and predominantly men. I'm wondering sort of the political meaning in that, right, on the larger display for the country.
I think it contributes to this sense that existed among members of the Ashkenazi Jewish establishment of backwardness, of Mizrahi Jews coming from places in which, it was perceived that women were less liberated, that women were less able to have a political a voice in the public sphere. I think that was, a very conscious thing. In fact, one member I interviewed, his wife participated in the interview and, in fact, translated the interview between us. And she told me about having the experience. So if women produced a certain number of children for the Israeli state, they were given a special award by the government.
Wow.
Yes. And Mizrahi women in particular, that was seen to be their role within Israeli society, because Mizrahi Jews were seen as the labor class, the working class within Israel. Women were meant to produce as many children as possible in order to keep that working class thriving. And that was rewarded by the government. If you produced, I don't remember offhand exactly how many children it was, but it was a sizable number. And so that was kind of seen as your role at that point in time by the nation.
It seems so inverted, right? I mean, I'm used to hearing society saying no working class people do not have any more kids, right? Like sort of discouraging poor people from having kids, and even creating a sort of pathology, or at least a politicization of this as a pathology, right? Of poor people who can't control themselves, and that also sort of contributing to the racialization of the poor, the racialization potentially of people of color and the like. So that's interesting that they were encouraged to have more children. And they were actually the numerical majority at the time of the formation of the Black Panthers, were they not?
That's right. Yeah. So around the time of the 6-Day War in 1967, they comprised the numerical majority and still do today.
That's really interesting because, again, I think in the press, at least in the U.S. side, what we mainly see the Ashkenazi representation, right? We still don't see very much of Mizrahi Jews as the face of Israel beyond Israel. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about some of the sort of socialist aspects of the Zionist project, right? The establishment of the Jewish state, and where the Israeli Black Panthers fit in this, because it seemed to be there's a slight disconnect between the sense of ethnic nationalism and the economic socialist project, especially if you're identifying perhaps as someone who's of Moroccan descent and not quite Israeli, or who maybe identifies as Israeli but has socialist leanings that are even further to the left of the state and the Zionist project.
Right. So there was a sense in which Israelis who migrated to Israel or who were second generation immigrants were very much encouraged to accept this kind of socialist melting pot ideal that was framed around, of course, a shared Jewish identity, but also around a sort of a left-leaning or a classically liberal sense of tolerance and acceptance. And those who came from the countries that were from the Middle East, or those who were from the Middle East and North Africa, when they arrived and they found themselves, in fact, not wholly incorporated into that, under that Zionist umbrella, if you will, this sort of led them to identify differently. The sense of having something more in common with your immediate neighbors in your neighborhood than with a lot of other people that you might see around you in a city, led them to think of themselves as somehow separate within the eyes of the government, but then also within their own kind of renderings of their relationship to the state. So they felt as though, this was like a distinctively stratified class grouping for them. So this kind of created a working class identity that was almost entirely synonymous with Mizrahi identity. And this sort of flew in the face of what the Israeli government had been saying about the creation of a kind of socialist ideal, right? It suggested that, in fact, not all of the wealth in the country was being shared equally among people, and that Kochavi Shemesh, one of the Panthers, talked to me about how, they distinctly argued that American Jews were contributing money to this kind of socialist Zionist state, and yet the Black Panthers were not seeing any money go to the peripheries, go to the places in which they lived. And so for them, there was kind of a distinct disconnect. And because this hadn't yet been realized publicly, it was a difficult argument to make at the time. They faced a lot of resistance for simply claiming that there was racialized stratification within the country. And although today I think we take this as given in, almost all parts of the world, at the time to say it was really to undermine the ethos of the entire state project. So it was not only a threat to their own well-being, but it was a threat to the state, or it was perceived as a threat to the state to say this.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of their relationship with the state, were they ever incorporated in some way, or did any of the Israeli Black Panthers pursue politics themselves? And what sort of parties were they joining later on?
Yeah, so they were, in the initial days, there were reformist efforts to kind of incorporate their concerns. So immediately after their first protest, Golda Meir met with them, as I talked about earlier, and she set up a committee to explore the concerns of ethnic youth. So, in her terminology,
it reminds me of like nowadays, anyone who's non-white is ethnic. It's just so interesting that they are still using something similar to that at the time.
Yeah, it was an effort. I think it's always right. It's a real effort to not want to use the language of race, because that leads to allegations of racism. But if you can sort of put it under an ethnic grouping, that somehow seems less threatening. That's at least my read. But obviously, out of that, there was funding set aside for the concerns of Mizrahi youth, but that largely, of course, failed to accomplish the kind of change that the Panthers wanted. And so in 1973, they began to sort of gather momentum and interest in national politics. So a couple of their members became leaders in the Histadrut, which was the National Labor Union. And one of their members, Charlie Biton, became a member of the Knesset, so a member of parliament, on a Black Panther ticket. Wow. From 1977 to 1992. He served as an MK. They formed a coalition as well with the Social Democrats. And one of their members, Reuven Abergel, became involved in Hadash, which was a communist-leaning party. Over time, they've tended to lean more to the right, as Mizrahis in general. That said, a number of the most vocal Black Panthers still are in support of some of the recent leftist organizing that's been taking place within Israel. So the Jerusalem housing protests of 2011, for example, Kochavi Shemesh talked about being contacted by current Israeli leftist activists asking for advice, because the Panthers were kind of the last really strong leftist movement within Israel. So they sort of were sought out. One of the days I interviewed Kochavi, he was appearing on national radio, giving advice to activists. Others went. Charlie Biton spoke at the protests. Reuven Abergel worked with protesters, and also worked with a group of protesting African refugees a few years before that. So there really is a kind of interest in and fusion of some of the ideals of the movement into a lot of the contemporary organizing that's happening right now. And oftentimes, I think in the West, we don't hear much about that. There's such an effort to censor mainstream media that takes place that often, we hear a lot about, we hear a lot more about the Israel-Palestine conflict and the occupation, and we don't often hear about some of the dissent that is happening within the Israeli state.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious too about are there any more Black Panthers that are involved in political organizing today? And is there sort of, because you mentioned that they are connecting, they're making connections with, the more contemporary leftist movement, or at least the leftist movement now is trying to make connections, I should say, in their direction. But where are most of the former members? What are they doing politically, if anything at all? And what sort of created the breakdown? Why am I speaking of the Israeli Black Panthers in the past more than the present? What sort of led to their dissolution later on?
A number of things. One is that they were pretty quickly infiltrated by the government. And I talk about this in the book. This has been recognized in public documents, that there was a member who was placed who was, for example, providing Molotov cocktails to the organization. And this was, of course, leading to greater possibilities of incrimination and arrest. So that, and that person was acting as an informant to the government. And it's believed by some members that further informants became part of the organization as a result of that. But on top of that, some of the Panthers have passed away. So Saadia Marciano passed away a few years ago. A man named Danny Sa'el, who was Iraqi and did a lot of organizing elsewhere in the country, went back to Iraq because he grew really fed up with conditions in Israel and became really involved in the political left in Iraq and actually passed away there. And then others have stayed really involved, not necessarily in party politics, although Charlie Beaton is the kind of strongest example of someone who, took a political route, was elected to the Knesset and worked there for 15 years and is now retired. Others have stayed really involved with on-the-ground grassroots organizing. And I think the most emblematic of this is Reuven Abergel, who is Moroccan and is still very involved, thinking about the concerns of African refugees. He gives a Black Panther memory tour of Mizrahi to kind of bring people in the current climate to even understand that that dissent has been a political fact within Israel, right? So the needle is pushed, far to the right at the moment, and to even kind of keep that discourse alive is part of what he sees as his own political work. And then he's involved with an organization that documents the effects of the occupation. Some others, I think, grew frustrated with the kind of liminal space that their organization occupied. So, raising concerns about the conditions of life for Mizrahi Jews, wanting to think about something broader, especially in terms of alliance and coalition with Palestinians, and found that organizationally that was very difficult to realize. For some of the reasons I mentioned, some people didn't agree with it, were more interested in local grassroots neighborhood organizing within their own communities for the security reasons that I mentioned. And Kokavi Shemesh, who was kind of the ideological leader, the thinker of the group, if you will, or the kind of the most outspoken thinker of the group. He did actually go to East Germany in the mid 1970s, where he met with Angela Davis. He got involved in some kind of pan-leftist organizing. But, one of the things that the European left sort of could have given more attention to at the time, and since has come along quite a long way, was around the Palestinian question and around questions of the needs of people of color more broadly. And at the time, I don't think that was exactly where the European left was. And so that kind of coalition wouldn't have really produced what people like Kochavi Shemesh was hoping for either. So there was an absence of some of the formations that we see today in terms of Palestinian organizing within Israel, right? And of course, the Black Panthers in the U.S. were very much recognizing the occupation and the kind of imperialist goals and machinations of the Israeli government at that point in time. So a real sort of disconnect on that particular issue.
Mm-hmm. One of my last questions about the Israeli Black Panthers, you had mentioned that several had gone to the right, and that the majority of this Mizrahi population identifies politically on the right. I am really shocked by this, and maybe I shouldn't be. But and this is one of the reasons why I'd asked the question about the seeming disconnect between the sort of socialist underpinnings of the Zionist project and the Mizrahi Jews themselves politically, because I don't know, I found it surprising, and I wondered if there was an attempt to also sort of define the self in opposition to the Palestinian cause. If you could talk a bit about that, because especially if they are physically, right, like phenotypically similar, perhaps, to the quote-unquote enemy that's framed by the state, how do they then define themselves within the Israeli state as part of the Israeli state? They're kind of, I mean, as you mentioned, it's a liminal space for them, right? So I'm wondering if the rightward shift has anything to do with that, or if it's a completely separate sort of political formation.
It certainly does. I remember someone I interviewed early in this project who was not a member of the Black Panthers, but is of Mizrahi origin and had lived in Israel for quite some time, talked about what it's like to have been arrested or stopped by the police in Zion Square because of the color of his skin. And to have been accused of being there illegally, i.e. assumed to be Palestinian, because he had distinctly darker skin tone than other people around him. The interesting thing about that person's story is that they also had an identity document, or were able to produce an identity document that showed that they were not in fact Palestinian, and that, you know, that sort of claim to belonging actually resulted in a claim to differentiation as well, right? And something that's understandable from that person's point of view, wanting to get away from the arrest of the police, but I think in a larger sense has contributed to Mizrahi Jews in general kind of being concerned with the kind of strength of their economic development, and wanting to sort of maintain themselves as full, you know, as full members of the state of Israel, and as much as that is politically possible for them.
You know, like I said, I didn't really know anything about this subject at all many years ago. And the more and more I learn about it, the more fascinating I think it is, particularly considering every time we hear about Israel in the news, as you said, there's sort of a dominant narrative. We don't hear as much about dissent that's taking place within the country on a variety of levels. And so sort of learning about the history of that through this angle, I think is really important and worth discovering more and more about in the future. So your work is obviously a huge contribution to that, and I really appreciate it. Speaking of your work, I noticed that you were on strike, or you've been off and on strike. I'd love to hear a bit more about what's going on at your university and in the UK in general, as we're speaking about social movements, right? We have so many teacher strikes going on in the US, and I've noticed that this is not just a U.S. phenomenon, right? There's certainly an international component. So if you would like to speak a bit about that, since you are involved, I'd love to hear more.
Sure. And thanks very much for your kind words. So I'm part of what's called the University and College Union at the University of Sussex, where I work. It's a national union. And we're currently in dispute with an organization called Universities UK, which is the governing body of universities throughout the country, over a proposed a significant change to our pension that would essentially result in the loss of roughly £10,000 per year per person in retirement. This is part of a long-term neoliberalization of higher education that's been taking place in the UK over about the past 15 years, I'd say. And in many ways, it's interesting in the sense that many of the things that are happening here happened long ago in the United States, because the U.S. has, higher ed has been marketized in the United States for a considerable amount of time, generally, since its founding. So, this has resulted in things like the imposition of tuition fees. And a really important one right now is that enrollment caps have been lifted. So it used to be the case that universities were told by the government a certain number of students that they could enroll. And just recently, the government lifted the enrollment cap. And what this may well lead to is the shuttering of less elite institutions within the country. So there are 61 institutions right now that are on strike. It's the largest form of industrial action that's ever taken place in the UK higher education sector. And we had 14 days of national strike action at the end of February and the first half of March. This has led to a proposal, or two proposals rather, from the employers, the first of which was roundly rejected by all of the branches. The second of which has been sent to a ballot of members, which not all branches believed should have been sent to ballot. But we're currently voting on a proposal that would create a joint panel that would revalue our pension fund and provide perhaps new proposals, or could possibly also recycle some of the proposal that we were already given earlier in March. So the vote lasts through tomorrow. So by tomorrow evening, we should probably know if we're going to continue striking in May and June, or if the strike is finished, in which case we will be watching the work of that panel very carefully and be prepared to ballot nationally to go on strike again in the next academic year if we need to. So it's a fraught time, but it's also been an incredibly invigorating time, I would say. It's been exhausting and exciting at the same time. At our branch, we've had a lot of strike sing-alongs, which have been fantastic. We've rewritten the words to everything from Cher to Dolly Parton to the Beatles. And we've seen some strong support from students. Our student union has been fantastic. And one of the most meaningful things for me has just been getting to know other colleagues. So the way that our system is set up, and as is the case at many universities over here, we're often in competition with other departments for students, and that comes with a lot of financial implications. And so you don't often get to know colleagues that are, perhaps working on similar issues as you, but a slightly different discipline. So that part alone has been great. I now know a lot more scholars working on race, working on issues related to people of color, social movements, so I think what has been a trying time has actually been fruitful in a lot of ways. And I look forward to kind of seeing, I think there's a lot of talk of rank and file movement. I've joined a rank and file national conversation that's going on. Nice. To push things, because our union is working hard, but it's not always necessarily representing all of the members. So we're working on that.
That's awesome. I know that today's Thursday, the 12th of April, so by the time this podcast comes out, the strike might actually be over. But nevertheless, if it's still going on, I wish you all the best of luck. And if it's done at the time, I hope that you all were able to sort of at least get the ball rolling for some of your demands being met. Is there a website or anywhere that people can learn more about the strike?
Yes. So the website of our union is ucu.org.uk.
Okay.
That's the best place to go. And then if you go on Twitter and you check the hashtag UCU strike or USS strike, there is a ton of activity going on. And I especially want to highlight the work of a group called at USS Briefs. They're a grassroots group of scholars from all over the country who've put together an incredible set of about 17 different 1 to 2 page documents that highlight the history of higher ed, neoliberalization, and what's been going on in the strike. So it's a good resource to check out.
That sounds great. Well, again, thank you for that. And thank you so much for joining me today. This is really fascinating. And I hope that people can learn more about your project and your upcoming book project, as well as the Black Panthers in Israel and other groups that did similar work around the time in the 60s and 70s, as well as obviously your strike. They can check more out in the show notes. So thanks so much again, Anne-Marie. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Wendy. Thanks a lot for having me.
Thank you for listening to episode 15 of the Left Pocket Project podcast. As always, you can stay caught up with the podcast on Soundcloud, Spreaker, and iTunes, and get more information about the project via social media by searching for Left POC. And finally, while I always appreciate donations on Patreon, you can also show your support by liking, sharing, and telling a friend, family member, or coworker about the Left Pocket Project. Thanks again for listening, and have a good one.